good afternoon, depending upon where you are. I'm very honored to be the first person in this new year's series of webinars to address this group of the Prague Process countries. Let me just start by getting my presentation up and share the screen with you, because I'll go through a series of slides to try and illustrate what I want to show to you. That should be, I think, a full screen that you can see. And the first slide really just sketches the series of very brief subsections I have to this presentation. I want to start by looking at the global and historical context very, very briefly, because I think it's important that we think historically and geographically. And I'll start and finish with some geographical and historical points. I will then look at what I call the frontiers of global and national demographic change, because when we look at demographic change, we tend not to think spatially or over time, or at least quite often we think over time, but we don't look at the patterns across space. And as I'll try and make quite clear in this presentation, that fertility, mortality, and migration are systems that diffuse across space. I'll then go on to look generally at the consequences of the demographic change, focusing mainly on the most developed parts of the world, particularly the EU, and then come on to section 4, which will be the core of the presentation, which is the population change in the non-EU countries of the Prague Process. So I'll look at the trends in fertility and migration and the implications that they have for the countries of the Prague Process. On the 5th section, I'll have just 1 or 2 slides to look at the policy options that you can employ to address these changes. I then come on to the last 2 sections in conclusion, one to focus on the shortage of youth and what that means for migration, and then to come back to this idea of the frontiers of migration, location, and a general conclusion. Migration, of course, is a very hot topic. It tends to generate more heat than light, I think. What I'll try and do is just to show you what I think the science tells us about what migration is doing. And I want to emphasize that 2 things really. The countries of the Prague Process are part of global shifts. And so you can look at what's going on in the countries of the Prague Process, but you also have to see that as part of global shifts. Because if we're seeing these demographic variables as part of a diffusion process, quite clearly they are diffusing into and across the countries of the Prague Process. I think we need to move away from ideas of exceptionalism. Most likely we see about the idea of an American exceptionalism. And of course, to some extent, every country is exceptional. They have their own particular patterns. But there are certain global themes, if you like, that transcend these specific patterns. Certainly we see variations upon these themes, but we must be aware that they are part of long-term processes. And I emphasize long-term. And that's always problematic for policymakers, because when you implement policy, you want to see results. Now, with demographic issues, fertility, mortality, and migration, instant results are not likely to happen. They happen over the medium to longer terms. Now, I want to start off with the most blindingly obvious point to make, that the rise of modern population is, in terms of human history, is fairly recent. And this little graph takes you from 10,000 BC up to more or less the present. And you can see that the graph goes off the scale on the right-hand side, and that's indicating the growth of world population. It didn't really start a sustainable growth until the 16th, 17th centuries. And so in terms of human history, this population growth is recent, 250, 300 years. The interesting thing, at least what I find particularly interesting is that we are now on a cusp when we're seeing a transition away from growth towards incipient decline globally, but specific population declines for some countries. At the global level, we don't have, of course, specific and exact dates, but we estimate that the numbers for the global population will peak probably between 2070 and 2100. In other words, it's at the towards the end of our current century. We'll see the population reach a peak somewhere between 9 and 10 billion and then begin to fall. But that's, of course, a global figure. And if we're looking at specific countries, that since 2010, there've been 27 countries, according to UN estimates, 27 countries that have already embarked upon this process of population decline. And the number of countries that will be declining by 2050, which is in the lifetime of probably most of my listeners, if not my own, the number of countries will have reached 55. 55 countries experiencing demographic decline year on year. So, I mean, one of the most astonishing ones to think about, possibly, is what has been the most populous country in the world, China, which will experience a decline of over 31 million between 2019 and 2050. In Europe, we tend to be concerned about population slowing and population decline. But let's just think that that China, as well as its neighbors, the Republic of Korea, South Korea, and Japan. And Japan has been declining since 2010. So increasingly, we are in a world of declining populations. Now, in some way, that's a good thing. You might see it as this is good because the discussions, and we'll have a global environmental conference in about a month's time with global climate change, might think that declining populations are a good thing. Well, I suppose, but of course, first of all, that the emissions are not just a product of simple population numbers, but of consumption patterns. And that the challenges of declining populations that will confront us over the next generation, over the next 70 years or so, will be in the same order as the challenges that we faced with rising populations in the previous century. So, you know, it is a good thing from some points of view, but it will bring a whole series of challenges. And here I just want to show you from recent United Nations figures the global patterns. And I just want you, there's a lot of numbers here, so don't panic, but I'll just talk you through very slowly what the numbers mean. And I want to focus on the top line, just looking at the world at the global level. And you'll see that I have 4 sets of columns. One that starts giving the data for the early 1950s, and it takes us up to the 2020s. In each of these columns, there are 3 sub-columns. The first is TFR, total fertility rate, and that is the number of children the average woman would have at the end of her reproductive lifestyle. Now, of course, I'm not silly enough to believe there's any such thing as an average woman, but it's a statistical measure. It's not an ideal measure, but it gives us an idea of how fertility is changing. And in the early 50s, the average woman had almost 5 children. By the time we're reaching our present time in the 2020s, it's estimated that the average woman is having less than half of that, about 2.4 children. Now, the transformation in mortality is equally abrupt, equally astonishing. In the early 1950s, the average person in the world lived for about 47 years. That was the expectation of life at birth. By the 2020s, that has reached in about 74 years. Again, another complete transformation in how we live our lives and how we reproduce and how we live and die. But it's also in where we live. And the third of these sub-columns is the proportion of the population that lives in cities. In the early 50s, it was about 30%. of the world's population lived in urban areas. By the mid-20s, it's 58%. We are already in an urban world. Now, it's just to put this demographic shift and migration shift in a context. You always have to think about this declining fertility, increasing longevity, and increasing proportions of people living in urban areas. That's the context in which these demographic changes are occurring. Now, of course, obviously, there's huge variation from one part of the world to the other. Sub-Saharan Africa, what's going on in Sub-Saharan Africa, it's very different from what's going on in Latin America and the Caribbean, let alone in Europe and North America. But I don't want to get too involved in these subdivisions. You'll have the figures and you can look at them yourself. Some of the results might not be entirely what you might expect, but there you are. That's just the overall context. Now, I've got three maps that I'm going to go through very, very quickly because I didn't want to get involved in actually bringing up the website where I could slide the cursor from left to right so you could actually see the transformation. But these slides show how the areas of high fertility are declining. In other words, there's a diffusion of a fertility frontier. So this is the global situation in the 1950s. This would be about the 1975, 1980, and you can see already it's getting smaller. And by 2015, it's limited basically to Sub-Saharan Africa, one or two countries outside. You can see Afghanistan, Iraq, and Yemen there, as well as Papua New Guinea. So what we're seeing is basically just islands of surviving high fertility, and these are getting smaller because we can see this, what's going on at the global level, we can see it within states, because we tend to think of our data presented only for the states, but there are huge differences from one part of an individual state to another, from one part of a country to another. And I'm just going to show you one example of this, and that comes from Thailand. And the dark areas are areas of high fertility, and these are differences between the early 1970s and the late 1970s. So a very rapid transformation in Thailand, with these areas of high fertility going to the margins of Thailand. So, and of course, that's continued to this day. But the point is, the simple point I want to get across to you is the very important changes from one part of every state, because we could look at every country where we could we find these figures. We could look at every country and generate maps that would be similar. We might find some exceptions. That's always possible. You can always find an exception, but I'm showing what seems to be the norm. The time that it takes for countries to move through a transition varies, and how quickly, and the space, the distances over which this transformation takes place, that also changes. So you've got to see this in terms of a process changing at varying rates through time and across space. And of course, this is the standard model that we all use with the stages of the demographic transition. Now, it's called the demographic transition, but this particular chart only deals with fertility and mortality. And you will see on the left-hand side, it says here pre-modern. It really means pre-industrial. Actually, fertility tends to go up when you move from a pre-modern to a more modern society, and that's not on this graph, but we won't go there. But what drives the fertility transition is, in fact, the decline in mortality. Mortality, with one or two exceptions, mortality always declines before fertility decline. And by the time you reach the right-hand side, you reach both low levels of fertility and mortality, and aging society, which also is not growing very quickly. Now, that's the standard. I'm sure that most of you are very familiar with this model, but of course, I said only fertility and mortality. There's no migration. Now, what happens if we try to put migration? And one of the earliest attempts was by Wilbur Zielinski, an American geographer, in 1971. And if you try to envisage in each of these mini graphs, there's 1 to 5 along the horizontal axes of each of these mini graphs. These are these stages of fertility and mortality decline. And this is what Zelensky argues happens. International migration climbs and then slowly tails away. He's got what he calls frontier movement, and that's very American, and it's a bell-shaped curve. It wouldn't apply to every country, and not to most European countries in their recent history, at least. This is rural-urban migration, which is what you might expect. It's a bell-shaped curve. As societies become more urban, rural-to-urban migration declines, as urban-to-urban and intra-urban migration increases over these phases of the demographic transition. I won't say anything about circulation because Zelensky got this bit wrong. At least I think he did. And I've spent much of my life looking at patterns of human circulation. But I just want to flag up these two patterns at the bottom here. And he argues that potential migration absorbed by circulation. In other words, we can commute. Commuting would reduce, in this argument, in this case, it would reduce migration. You don't have to migrate, but you can commute over relatively short. But now we're seeing long distance commuting. But most interesting is this one, potential circulation absorbed by communication systems. And I think this was, to put this in a graph form in 1971 was really quite perceptive. I remember almost 50 years ago. Basically what he's saying is that we don't have to even to circulate. I can sit in my little town in northern Scotland and communicate with all of you people right across Europe and parts of Asia. I don't have to move. I don't have to circulate. I certainly don't have to migrate. And so the evidence that we have now from the most developed parts of the world is that internal migration is slowing or declining. All right, let's look at some consequences. Now, the most obvious consequence of these shifts, and this is a map from Eurostat data, and it takes us right up to the end of this century, which is a pretty, even though it's a baby born today, given longevity, has a good chance of surviving to the end of the century. So it's possibly just the lifetime of those born around now, so which isn't that long. And what you can see is that in the eastern parts of Europe and in the southern part of Europe, there's marked demographic decline. In fact, the only parts of Europe that's increasing slowly but sustainably are in the north, in Sweden and Norway. You can see that my own country, the United Kingdom, is down there in the same category as Sweden. I'm wondering post-Brexit whether that will actually come to pass or not. And also that it doesn't look at those subnational units. Scotland, the northern half, is a population that is actually in decline. So the more marginal parts, with the exception of Norway, do tend to be experiencing demographic decline if we put Scotland in a different category. Now, these are some figures just to get this across, what that map means and a little bit more. And I'm taking a much shorter time period here, which is much more realistic, 2015 to 2030. In other words, this is a policy time horizon. The policies that you would implement now, you would hope to see in operating by 2030. It's a 15-year period, but of course, 9 years from now. And what this shows is that the population, and it's not the total population, it's the labor force. In other words, the economically active population as defined by that age group, 24 to 64 years age group. And I'll come back to that particular definition later on in the presentation. But that's the group we're using. And the Europe, you can see, is going to decline by about over 30 million people in those 15 years, 2015 to 2030. And most of that decline is in Eastern Europe and in Southern Europe. Eastern Europe and Southern Europe. You can see the labor force of Eastern Europe, and of course that does include Russia under the UN definitions. It's declining from 171 million workers to 148 million workers over that 15-year period, which is a marked decline. The United Kingdom, you will see, is a slight increase. But as I say, post-Brexit, I'm not sure, I'm not convinced in my own mind that will actually happen. I'll just look at Germany. Germany's labor force will decline, or is projected to decline from about 45 million in 2015 down to 41.5 million by 2030. In other words, a decline of over 3 million. Now, there was a huge outcry about Germany taking in 1 million refugees. Now, in the context, and let's exclude political considerations for a moment. In the context of a labor force that will see a decline of over 3 million in 15 years, to take in 1 million people who are in these prime productive and reproductive age groups seems, well, let me put it in a negative way. It seems not illogical, double negative, all right? But that's without taking into consideration politics in this. But demographically, you've got to see that refugee flow in that context. Now, I just put China there as an interesting one, because its labor force will decline from 835 million down to 817 million. Quite a marked decline. The era of cheap labor in China is over. At the bottom, I put the United States. It increases, its labor force increases from 168 million to 175 million. United States is different. It's still aging, as you'll see, but it's different. Why? Well, I'll just leave that hanging for a couple of minutes. That's just the demographic profiles of Europe 2015 on the left, 2030 on the right. And you can see that that profile is marching on the right to a shape that demographers with their tongues in their cheek call the coffin shape of a dying population. Now, it's nowhere near that, frankly. I will show you the profile a little later on of a population that's much further down that line. Not a population in Europe, but another population. But that's the demographic profiles for Europe, 2015, 2030. These are the demographic profiles for the United States, 2000 to 2025. And you can see that the United States is aging, but it's not aging as fast. Now the question is, why not? The United States has the largest legal immigration program in the world of 1 million people by and large. Fluctuates a little bit. It takes in large numbers of migrants who have a fertility slightly higher than those of the native population. But having said that, the evidence shows that the migrants take on the fertility behavior very quickly. They take on the fertility behavior of the native populations very quickly. So that the migrant populations age too. But the point is here that it's much slower than the United States. Overall, it has a higher fertility than any other developed nation, and it's aging slowly. Right, now let me turn to look at the countries of the non-EU countries of the Prague Process. And in all these charts, I've divided them into 4 different groups. The top, the Caucasus; the second group down, the Balkan countries; then the Central Asian countries; then what might call Russia and the countries that were integral parts of that. Of course, so were the Central Asian countries, but this is, if you like, the eastern and northeastern parts on the margins of Europe there, and Turkey down at the bottom as a separate category. Now, you will see that the Central Asian republics are exceptional. Their populations will continue to increase quite markedly right up to the end of the century. So Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, well, the exception is Uzbekistan, that after 2050 will see a slight, and it's probably not statistically significant, but these countries by and large will see sustained growth in their population, whereas other populations are decreasing right now. Georgia, for example, from 5.4 million in 1990 down to 2.5 million projected for 2100, 3.5 by 2050, and you can see this decline here from it's basically 4 million 2020 down to 3.8 million, 3.9 million in 2030. So that decline is going to get faster in Georgia. Azerbaijan too has a sustained rise in population to 2050, and then a decline thereafter. It's a bit similar to Turkey. Turkey will see its population rise to 2050 and then decline thereafter. So there's the temptation to say population decline is not going to impact upon us. Well, within a generation, it's something that policymakers will have to think about. Across the Balkans, population decline is happening right now in many of these countries. You can see Albania, 3.2, down to just over 1 million by the end of this century. Quite a marked decline. It was significant that the statement was made that Albania would welcome 5,000 refugees. Was that an act of altruism, or looking down the telescope towards where Albania is going to go? And you can see that pattern is repeated across the Balkans. So in some ways, the Balkans are already amongst those countries that are declining by 2050 and many by 2030. That scenario also applies to those countries to the east of Europe, Belarus, the Republic of Moldova, Russia, and the Ukraine. Marked declines in population, particularly towards the end of the century. Let me move on to the next chart, which shows the growth, which shows total fertility rates. And you can see that with the exception of the Central Asian countries, there really isn't a country that has fertility significantly above replacement level. So we're already there in terms of the slowing in fertility. Azerbaijan is just about replacement level, but that's projected to decline by the end of this decade. Replacement fertility is generally accepted to be somewhere between 2.1 and 2.2. All the Central Asian republics are well above replacement level. You can see that Turkey is, like Azerbaijan, right on the cusp. So that's where Prague Process, non-EU Prague Process countries are right now, and where we project them to be in terms of fertility. Now, this is net migration rate, as calculated through the United Nations World Population Prospects. With one or two almost insignificant exceptions, where the only significant exception on this chart was, in fact, Russia in the late 1990s into the early years of the 21st century. But with that exception, this chart is covered with negative figures. That is, there's more emigration than immigration. With the exception of Russia, there's really no significant magnet for migration. That net migration is negative, so that the majority of the countries, if you like, are hit by what could be called a double whammy: declining fertility and increasing out-migration. And so both of those factors impact upon where the population is going quite clearly. And there's no real prospect of a reversal in that pattern. So that, although that in Belarus, Russia, Ukraine, yes, you could say that the net migration, Kazakhstan, the net migration is more or less equal. It's on the positive side. It is on the positive side, but it's not at large scale the way you see it for some European countries or in North America. Now, it's very easy when we talk. It's very easy to forget when we are talking about migration, the internal migration exists. Now, I flagged it up with urbanization early on in this presentation, that it's a significant transformation of our world. And here we have, for the Prague Process countries, the proportion urban in 2020 and the projected proportion for 2050. And all Prague Process countries are urbanizing, but some are urbanizing faster than others. Again, the Central Asian republics are, if you like, behind the curve. Behind the curve. And you'll see that very clearly when I show the next slide. But we are seeing a concentration of population in all of those countries. Concentration in cities, towns, cities, and often the largest cities. So that's one of these long-term common processes. Certainly the variations. We sometimes see bumps along the road. There's a reversal. But over the longer term, it's a trend towards a rural depopulation and a concentration of population in towns and cities. Look at the Central Asian republics here, and you can see that they are the only ones with positive growth in their rural populations. The only ones. So all of the other areas are seeing a gradual decline in the rural population. And I'll show you later on a country that has an extreme, or there is an extreme case of this. Okay, this is just to reinforce the point that I've been making, because of course it's not just the decline in the potential decline in the total population, it's what's happening to the labor force. And because the labor force is the group that provides the economic basis for your country. They are the workers. They are the productive elements of the population. And you can see that for Armenia, for example, declining from 1.7 million in 1990 to less than 1 million by the end of this century. And we see from Georgia, 2.7 million down to 1.1 million. Albania, 1.5 in 2020, down to 384,000. That's an astonishing decline in the labor force. And quite clearly, that's going to have very important repercussions on how the economy reacts. And it's going to be one of the key challenges in this whole issue of reversals in the growth of population. Okay, now this is where I guess what you're all waiting for. What can be done about it? What can governments do? Well, there are a range of options available to governments. I have to be careful here because I'll try to do is flag up what I think are the problems with each and every one of them. The most obvious one is to increase fertility. Because as you saw, and as the theme of my talk, is that the fertility is a driver, is the most important driver. So could you reverse it? Could we increase fertility? The simple answer to that question is yes, we can. We have examples around the world where we have seen reversals in fertility decline. But, and there's a big but, the reversal is seen only when fertility reaches a very low level, about 1.2 children per woman, and it comes up only a little bit. It does not come up to replacement level. It comes up to about 1.6, 1.7. Now, how do you bring this about, a rise in fertility? The easy answer, and Singapore has tried this, is of course to pay people to have children or to reduce the taxes. For every child, the tax is reduced. So there are direct, you can put money into people's pockets for every child they have, or you can take, or you can allow them to keep more of the money they earn by reducing their tax. You do that indirectly over their lifetime. Now, the Singaporeans are very astute people, and they quickly worked out the amount of money that they were going to receive vis-a-vis how much it cost to raise a child to the age of 18. And that money is quite small relative to what it costs to raise a child. Now, quite clearly, the context is very important. Singapore is a very high cost society. And so what goes on in Singapore need not necessarily be relevant to what goes on somewhere else. But what I'm trying to say is that, yes, you can reverse fertility, but it's not going to come back anywhere near replacement level. It's not a solution to the issue of declining populations. And it's much more than these direct and indirect cash transfers. It's also the services that can be provided. In Sweden, which did bring its fertility up at one stage, it's very much paternity leave, maternity leave, and also the facilities for childcare. So this again is not, it's not a magic book. Then I put 2 is reduce access to abortion. Very, very controversial. And of course, it's no more controversial than in the United States of America. Now, of course, this part of, when we're thinking of development as a whole, what happens with development, it's increasing education of the population, and it's the population as a whole, men and women. And we know that as women become educated, they marry later, and they have fewer children. So this is going to be a very, not only a controversial issue, but a very difficult issue. And the problem with reducing access to abortion is that you won't stop abortions, you'll just drive it underground, and you'll increase the mortality of women. And so I can't put my hand on heart and say that this could be an example of best practice, because it isn't. Despite, I think, there are a lot of people who would like to implement such a policy, but the evidence seems to suggest that it is not likely to be effective in this bigger picture of declining populations. I could also add to that, of course, reducing access to knowledge of contraception. But again, you run into extreme politicized ideas here, and given the increasing rights and position of women, I very much fear that, or at least I would say that this is not a non-start. It's just a non-start. Now, what you could do, and we'll be looking at the issue of labor force, what do you do with these declines in the labor force that we've just seen? You can increase female labor force participation. Because when we look at these countries and the statistics, female labor force participation tends to be lower than that of men. And as countries develop, we see increasing female labor force participation. And of course, that is associated with lower fertility. And so to increase female labor force participation might be seen as a short-term solution to the issues of declining labor force, but they may actually accelerate declines in population because it will reinforce drives to lower fertility. So again, you've got to look at pros and cons here. I think the easiest one to think about is extend or change the definition of the labor force. And the one I used there was that straight demographic, the 25 to 64 age group. You just change that, and to change it to 65, to 66, to 67, to 68, but how far up? To 74, 75? Well, given longevity, and of course, I'm a little biased here because, of course, I would be I'm way beyond the normal retirement age as stipulated in the United Kingdom. So that changing the definition of labor force to incorporate older groups seems to me to be possibly one of the more sustainable policy options to slow the growth and slow that decline in the labor force. However, it's going to meet political resistance, as we've seen particularly in a country like France. And I think there's also a great difference in by occupation. It's all very well for somebody like me to sit here and extend my at least semi-working life. I don't work full time, but my semi-working life well into my 70s. It's a very different thing for somebody who drives a heavy duty, heavy goods vehicle, or a bus, or a coal miner, or somebody in heavy industry, to say to them, we expect you to work to 70, 73, whatever. So I think it cannot be a blanket option. It has to be applied carefully. Some people in my position, I'm sure, are only too pleased to work a little beyond accepted retirement age. Other people in other occupations will certainly not be. So we have to be very careful there. The fifth one, substitute physical for human capital. That's automation. Automation. Now, this pathway is only going to be open really to those countries that are wealthier. This is a difficult thing to do. But the other thing is, of course, it just changes the nature of the labor force. People don't lose their jobs. In fact, in some ways, advancing technology creates more jobs than it will destroy. So we have to be very careful here. Again, like the other ones, it's not a magic bullet. And the last one, of course, and most controversial though, is migration. To bring in people on a longer or shorter term basis to substitute for the decline. Now, if there's one thing that the evidence shows us, is that migration is not a solution to declining populations. At least it can help. It can help in specific sectors of the economy, but it will not, and it will slow the rate of overall decline, but it will not stop the decline. It will not stop the decline, simply because the numbers you would have to bring in, first of all, wouldn't be politically acceptable, but secondly, each country wouldn't be able to find sufficient numbers to stop that decline. So again, it's not a magic bullet. So I think the policy options will be basically concentrated around 3, 4, 5, and 6. Somewhere be a mix of that, and that mix will vary by countries. Already, I just found this yesterday. It was in a UN summary. It was one of the 10 key points, and it mentions, I just include it here because it mentions so many of these non-EU countries, Prague Process countries. Belarus is, Belarus, Russian Federation, Serbia, and Ukraine, together with Estonia, Germany, Hungary, Italy, and Japan, will experience a net inflow of migrants over the decade, helping to offset population losses caused by an excess of deaths over birth. And the emphasis is on helping to offset, It's not, even if they remain, this is not a solution to declining populations. Okay, I just want to flag this up. This is the importance of youth. There are very few robust generalizations we can make about migration. But one of them is that the majority of people who migrate, the majority of people who move are young adults, So in fact, the number of migrants in any population is a function. It's not a simple function, but they are a function of the number of young adults available to migrate. And this is the population 15 to 24 years old by certain countries. Now, just pick up a couple. In Europe as a whole, that's going to decline from 81 million. It's a slight decline between 2015 and 2030, then followed by a much more rapid decline. So the real impact is post 2030. That's not so far away. Eastern Europe, again, this decline from 33 million really down to 26 million, quite marked. Let me just flag up China, a decline from 185 million to 123 million. That is an astonishing decline. And the Chinese who do think long-term must be very, very aware of the implications of that. In other words, how many universities do you need? How many schools do you need? How many will want to go into the military? There are security implications here. Japan too sees a huge decline in its young population. I've just put here the declines in the non-EU countries in the Prague Process. You can see from, let me take Georgia, 826,000 down to 273. For a big country like Russia, from 23 million down to 14.5 million. Ukraine from 7.4 million down to 2.5 million. Marked declines in those people who are most likely to migrate and who are, after all, these are the future of your societies. I want to look at the implications that has for migration. And the country I want to look at is Japan, because Japan is much further down this road than many of the other countries that we've very briefly looked at. This is the overall population here, 103 million, but it's declined from 2010 from 126.5 million down, and is projected to be 108 million 0.5 by 2050. This is the population 20 to 24. I'm not consistent. It's for the just for the purposes of discussion. I'm looking at different age groups. This is the number of people 20 to 34 who were in those populations at that time. So a decline from 28 million in 1970 to 8.7 million in 2025, which is just 3 years from now. Now, I want to shift to these two figures here. These are two measures of internal migration in Japan. The intra-prefectural or local movements within cities primarily, and these are from one prefecture to another. In 1970, if we add those two together, we've got 8.2 million. So 8.2 million migrants in 1970. By 2010, this has declined to about 5 million. Now, it's not all about demographics. It's not all about demographics. It's the nature of the housing market and the labor market as well. But we have seen a remarkable decline in internal migration in Japan, remarkable decline. And we see that repeated in the United States, in the United Kingdom, Australia, and Canada. Declines in the internal movement of population. And I think a message to think about is how to supply basic services. That's not in a policy option. This is a different policy area. It's how to supply basic services, essentially health and care, to aging and declining dispersed populations. This is very expensive. This is Japan. These are the population pyramids. By 2050, you can see what the demographers mean by coffin shape. Japan is almost in a demographic crisis because, of course, the Japanese have not opened their borders. The proportion of foreign born in Japan is 2 to 3%. When the Japanese did look for migrants, they looked to Brazil. Curiously, Brazil. Why Brazil? Because there is a very large population in Brazil of descendants of Japanese. They went there in the 1930s, 20s, and 30s. They looked Japanese. They looked Japanese, and so the Japanese government thought, let's bring them back because they will help to fill the labor shortage. They came back, and they looked Japanese. But between the ears, they were not Japanese. They were Brazilian. They played loud music. They threw their rubbish where they shouldn't. The spoken Japanese wasn't as good as the native population, and their reading Japanese was poor. They were Brazilians, but they looked Japanese. And so there's a word of caution here about the types of migrants you bring in. You try to bring in people who will seem to integrate, who look like you, but in fact, they're not. They're different. And the Koreans have discovered this, and the Chinese are discovering this with the overseas Chinese. The bit about depopulation, the black parts, these are the islands of Japan. The black parts are areas of what the Japanese call severe rural depopulation. Basically, only old people live in these areas. And that is a key policy challenge. Now, I'm coming to the end of this presentation. What I want you to see, this map is a very crude map, but it shows you in each of these areas, in each of these colored regions, you have different patterns of migration. But they move, that the core areas expand. This is the core area of Europe, and it's expanding into this area, which includes a lot of Prague Process countries, or non-EU Prague Process countries, into what at this time was a labor frontier. because these countries in Eastern Europe and further east provided labor for Europe. No longer. The labor frontier has moved eastwards and southwards. That's why these areas circled there. We're seeing exactly the same southern United States and Mexico, that the labor frontier, the core area and the labor frontiers move southwards. So we have to be there again, coming back to this idea of shifting areas of migration. Not only does the migration change over time, but it changes across space. So key message of this presentation. You need to think long-term about policy options. When I was seconded to the British government, a key question I asked was, where is the United Kingdom going to find its labor 10, 15, 20 years time from now? Because quite clearly at that time, 2010, most of our unskilled labor came from the countries of the Eastern EU, the Eastern Europe, Romania, Poland, Bulgaria. But given their fertility, they're not going to have migrants to supply, thinking longer term. So where are the next wave of migrants going to have to come from? And the reaction of the British government, very interesting. Are you mad? They said to me. Are you mad? That's 3 or 4 governments away. We don't have to think about that. That's not our affair. Next question. They didn't want to think long term. And that's the advantage the Chinese might have. They think long term. Now, I'll just conclude with this cartoon, which comes from my favorite comic, which is The Economist magazine, extremely good magazine in the United Kingdom. Many of you probably read it. And it had this on its front cover a couple of years ago. It's a special report on the rise of robots. And you can see what's already come to pass. Parcels are being delivered by drones. And here we have a very large robot looking after a young person while his parents are at work. Substitution of capital for labor. And here we have a little smaller robot feeling grandma. Again, I mean, this is a cartoon. It's a cartoon. It's not serious. But we have to think. It's an important message that we have to think about. And on that note, ladies and gentlemen, I will stop. High fertility is a function of less development. Let's put it that way. Simply because mortality tends to be higher, and so you have more children to compensate for infant mortality. And people will not stop having more children until they see that the children they have survive to adulthood. So, you do tend to see areas that are less developed with high levels of fertility. And most obviously, it was where I very quickly glossed over that the last major area of high fertility is Sub-Saharan Africa, with the outliers of Yemen, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And I think what's going on in Afghanistan right now is fascinating, particularly their attitudes to women. And quite clearly, I mean, this is part of the gender tensions. But whether that's sustainable over the long term, I doubt. And of course, it's an anathema to us in the West that these issues are actually being implemented. But to try and give you a direct answer to your question, yes, indeed. And I hope that is a takeaway from my message, that the countries of Central Asia will be an important and increasingly important source of supply of labor to the Prague Process countries. Absolutely, absolutely. And given their demography, that will continue. If you're thinking, even that should make you more of an optimist, because that source will be open until the end of this century. So it gives you the opportunity to plan adequately for this transition to declining populations. But the Central Asian countries are going to be critically important in this process, and for the Prague Process countries. And it will transform not only the Prague Process countries, but it will also transform the countries of origin. Now, I haven't talked about that at all in my presentation because, that's migration and development, which is really a different aspect, a completely different aspect of the same topic, if you like. But I didn't talk about that. It will transform the countries of origin. And ultimately, of course, right at the end, and I talked about spatial diffusion, the last country to be impacted will probably be Afghanistan. But maybe I don't want to become too controversial, but the one country missing in this discussion is Iran, for obvious reasons. But Iran demographically is fascinating because it has a very, very low fertility. And it's already importing, one way or the other, large numbers of young people. I think so. I mean, there's never going to be an answer. And from some of the things I've said, I know some of you will throw up your hands in horror and say, no way. But what I hope I've done is to say, well, if you're going to say that, you've got to look at the alternative, because this is the direction that you will go. And so, I mean, the easy one, relatively easy one, although the French have shown that it's not easy, is to change the labor force. And of course, it's being done year by year. And there are a lot of people who feel that this isn't just, that they look at a generation like mine and said, we had it easy, you could retire at 65. Well, yes, I mean, I have to hold my hands up. Yes, that's true. But I continued to work. I worked full time until I was almost 70. And I continued since then on a part-time. I joined, if you like, the Geriatric Gig Economy. Now there's a little headline for you: the Geriatric Gig Economy. If people are interested in what you say, or they want somebody to stir up a hornet's nest, they ask you to come along and at least give a different viewpoint, because my viewpoint, I think, is a little different, simply because I spent over 30 years outside Europe, working in Latin America and primarily Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, and East Asia, and the Pacific. And after I came back to Europe, I had a chance to work in Sub-Saharan Africa. So, it's always it's useful for governments to have somebody like me saying, excuse me, have you thought about where Japan's going, for example? Have you thought about that? Because the Japanese have been there and they've taken this chair, because quite clearly the Japanese solution is much more along the automation line, much more. But they're a very wealthy country. They can afford the investment in robots, and they are very clever people. They have a lot of universities, and they are cutting edge of automation. I mean, I saw lots of things in Japan when I was last there about 10, 11 years ago that are now commonplace in Europe. I think we learn from each other. And I tend to be optimistic. I think if you work in a kind of development field, you have to be optimistic. Or if you were a pessimist, you wouldn't last very long. But there isn't a single solution, but we will focus on those bottom edge of the last ones I looked at, of which migration is one. I think migration has to be part of the mix, but so too it has to be redefining always the bureaucratic solution is the easiest to address, and that's a redefinition of the labor force. But you can also look at, and Japan still today, there's a big difference between male and female labor force participation. But of course, to incorporate more women into the labor force will really continue that, it'll impact on that fertility decline, because more women will choose not to get married or to marry very late in life, and to have very small numbers of children. textbook that I've published, I look at the migration futures and the challenges. And the two big challenges, it seems to me, the first one, of course, is global environmental change. But the second one is integration. And we're seeing it even in, well, I shouldn't say even, but in countries like the United States, of course, migration is still a highly controversial topic, as we've seen, and with the previous president. And also, some of these policies have continued under the present president. But if you're looking, I mean, quite clearly, they focused a lot on the migration from Mexico to the United States. But that Mexican migration has turned around. More people are now leaving, more Mexicans are leaving the United States for Mexico than are leaving Mexico for the United States. In other words, the net migration between the two has changed. And that's because Mexico has gone through this demographic and, I could say, economic transformation. Right? Mexico is not just a narco state, as is so often portrayed. In many ways, it's one of these almost middle-income developing economies. And it's gone through a demographic transition. Mexicans in the United States are reaching retirement age. One of the things they can do, of course, is go from a relatively high-cost area of the United States back to Mexico. So Mr. Trump, in building his wall, in some ways is keeping more Mexicans in the United States than he's keeping the Mexicans out, in some ways. Because you don't want to go back to Mexico if you can't come back to visit your children in the United States. So, you've got to allow that free movement. Now, the big problem facing the United States right now at that border is the increasing participation of Central American countries and Caribbean. And remember, I talked about the diffusing frontier of migration, where once it was primarily from Mexico to the United States, it's now Guatemala, Salvador, Honduras. The most recent arrivals, as we've seen on our television screens, are from Haiti in the Caribbean. And so they've gone to Central America and then got on to the lines of transport up through Central America and Mexico to the American border. So the majority of people trying to get across now are not Mexicans. There are still some Mexicans, obviously, but the majority have been replaced of now Central Americans and Caribbeans, people from elsewhere. So what I'm trying to get across, that maybe I wasn't explicit enough, is that the countries go through a migration transition. Until 1960, Europe was a country, Europe was a continent, if you like. Europe was a continent of emigration. We populated the United States, that great Atlantic migration of the 19th and early 20th centuries. And Europe has turned from being a region of emigration to a region of immigration. And we've seen similar transformations in other parts of the world. So it changes. That's why I'm thinking, I'm trying to get across to you that you need to think longer term at the way in which these variables are changing. Migration need not be ever upwards. We are seeing a decline in the number of migrants in some parts of the world as they've gone through this demographic transition. A decline of international migrants, but a decline most prominently in internal movers. As I didn't show you the graphs from the United States, but it's quite clearly in the United States, as it was clear in Japan. I showed you the data from Japan, and the data from Japan are very robust. Japan has some very, very good data sources. So, so migration is never, ever increasing, but we are, if you decide to close your border, you will atrophy as a population and decline as some of the data seem to show for one or two Prague processes, and we know some other countries. So by keeping, you're not going to increase your fertility significantly above 2. That's a non-starter. You can bring it up, as I pointed out earlier, maybe from 1.2 to 1.6, 1.7 with the right investment, but you're not going to reverse that overall decline. And so if you decide to hold the border And of course, that drove Brexit. The Brexiters' key to that was let's stop immigration. Well, we're already seeing the consequences of that. And they're saying, well, it's a European problem. That's what our politicians, I was listening to them this morning. It's a European problem. There's a shortage here, there's a shortage there. Ah, yes, but there are no petrol queues in Germany and France. There are no empty shelves in the supermarkets in Germany and France. You know, it's an interesting issue. And so, you know, there's some very interesting work in the United States right now, looking at the new middle that's evolving in the US, the new middle, because quite clearly many societies are moving towards multicultural societies. Now I've spoken a sin, a multicultural, that's a word that is a no-no to a lot of people. But what's the option? What is the option? And you've always got to think of that over the long term, if you want to keep a homogeneous society. You know, some of the best work in migration, and here I'm going to show some of my biases at the moment, some of the best, most interesting work in migration is done by historians, because they've got that long view. And some of these historians of Europe have pointed out some countries have vanished. We have seen some countries disappear. They've had to link with their neighbors in order to survive. And in some ways, you know, that's what we're seeing, the creation of larger units. And I think that's going to be a trend, obviously amongst neighbors. But we tended to have fought amongst the neighbors. The Scots were fighting the English for many years, you know, that we weren't friendly neighbors. But we've now been incorporating. Whether we'll continue, I think possibly yes. But it's difficult to predict these things. Not all countries will survive to the end of this century. I'm not looking specifically at Europe. I'm thinking parts of Sub-Saharan Africa, or they may exist in name only, but de facto be part of a broader economic unit, simply because they have to get together in order to survive in terms of populations. There's a wonderful book on Europe by sadly departed Welsh historian Norman Davis, and it's called Vanished Kingdoms. And anyone interested in long-term political stability should read that book, because not all political units survive indefinitely, is what I'm saying. They change. So what I think we'll see the emergence of larger units, and within those larger units, you have smaller subnational still existing in the way that Scotland exists within England. And Scotland itself, of course, is not homogeneous. There's a big difference between the Gaeldom and the Lowland Scots, which tends to be papered over when we're talking about let's have an independent Scotland. There are big differences within Scotland, maybe not some, that still survive to this day. So, you know, yes, I understand the sensitivity, but I think you have to immediately say, yes, we're going to do this, close the borders. You've got to think, what are the implications of that? What are the implications over the long term? Over the long term. And some of these implications, as I say, may be unpalatable to many. She's absolutely right. And thank you for that question. I've not talked about it. And of course, that's a big fear in Europe. They're looking at the fertility in Africa. Are all the Africans going to come here? The simple answer to that question is no. Most Sub-Saharan Africans will migrate within Sub-Saharan Africa. And of course, when we're thinking of Africa, it's like painting with a brush. There are huge differences between West Africa and East Africa, between Central Africa and Southern Africa, huge differences. In the UK census of 2001, the immigrant group from Nigeria was the most educated of all migrant groups in the United Kingdom at that time, because it was a relatively young migration. These were the pioneers out of Nigeria. They were the highly educated, many of them educated in Britain, So there were the new middle classes of Nigeria. The followers are not quite so highly educated. But so we mustn't, it's not just a question of those who are uneducated coming to Europe. There's a highly skilled African labor force, West African labor force, and East African labor force, highly skilled. And they are moving, like many Europeans, they are moving transnationally. And I've talked about migration declining. What we're seeing is shifts in growing human circulation, of the migration of brains transnationally. And there's the evolution of what Leslie Sclair, an English, as I should say, a Scottish, he's based in London though, Scottish sociologist is called, a political scientist is called a new transnational class. In other words, we've got more in common, between people of that level of education and that level of experience, across ethnicity, if you like, than you have within your own group. And having worked in the United Nations, of course, I've seen that. We tend to think of, and I'm sure I'm talking to the converted here because I know there are many from international organizations listening, that you talk about the family, in the UN family. And that reflects this transnational capitalist class. I'm dodging your question. At the moment, what we're seeing is people from West Africa moving into Morocco, into North Africa, because there are labor shortages in countries like in North Africa, Morocco. So they're getting jobs in parts of North Africa, but most obviously want to move on to Europe. Yes, that migration will occur. I think it's up to us to manage it. And that's why having a settlement policy is so important. A diversity policy within that, as you manage your intake of people as potential citizens in the way that Canada, the United States, and Australia. As I say, there are problems with their programs. And the most important one, I think, for me, is if you want to understand the migration to Canada or the United States, don't look at the immigration statistics. Look at the non-permanent entries. And that tells you as much as the permanent entries do, because that's one way you can get around your immigration policy quickly. Because immigration policies tend to be very slow, but temporary entrants are people loud and fast. And of course, temporary entrants, a proportion of them will stay on. And you can recruit within the temporary entrance for your permanent entrance. So there's if you like, there's a stage process into those countries. And so I think Europeans need to think much more closely about immigration policy. It's not about keeping them out or only letting in workers. It's about thinking, who do you want to bring in on a longer term basis? How many? First of all, how many? And some countries will say no, but I've already said, think of the alternatives. If that's the way you want to go, that's your decision. Fine. I'm not going to advocate one against another. I'm not saying, no, let's open the gates. I'm not saying that. But all it's saying is that you need to have some sort of managerial capacity to deal with this long-term trend towards declining population. Migration has to be part of that mix, has to be. It's not the solution. As I say, the easy options initially are bureaucratic, definition of labor force, or technical. But migration has to be part of the mix.